just ask you a couple of questions first about Brighton, Dermot. Not
Yeah.
cities. Just tell me what you think of it in terms of the atmosphere, the sort of the whole scene around Brighton.
I really like Brighton. My sister lives in Brighton, so I've been... Yeah, she was one of those ones who left London in their early 30s to, scared of the London school system and came and brought up a family in Brighton. But it's got loads of other things going on as well. It's and it's come up as well in the last sort of five years. And whether it's there's a sort of new media bit to it. There's obviously the gay bit to it, but there's this sort of London, 30-something family types as well. And if they put it all together, actually the problems that Brighton's got now are things like congestion, issues like that. So the problems of success, really.
It's also nice about the seaside, isn't it? It gives you that sort of...
Yeah. And over the next few weeks we'll be going to a lot of seaside places, and this is my favourite.
So in terms of the city stuff, you mentioned you're going to be going to all the three parties.
Yeah.
How do you think they differ in terms of their sort of analysis of the problems and the solutions?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that every major political party has got a stake in our big cities. So, just come from an event just now, Newcastle and Liverpool, run by Lib Dems, Manchester, Bristol, Nottingham by Labour, and Birmingham and partially Leeds by the Tories. So every party's got to have an agenda on the whole future of our cities. So that's I think an interesting point. But they do differ actually in some ways. We're going to hear probably the Tories in a couple of weeks come out in favour of big city mayors, which no other party's really gone for quite like that. Michael Heseltine will be saying that. The Lib Dems have just published a policy document today on regional and local government, probably being more radical on, empowering local councils. And then Gordon has been trying to, rebrand himself as the great devolver. So each of them see a benefit in saying that they're going to give more powers to local councils, but in different ways.
Branding is an interesting word. It always strikes me that those politicians that are furthest away from power always talk a lot about giving power
of course,
away.
yeah.
But the ones that get the cookie jar always cling to it.
Well, that's typical. I think you are now hearing the Conservatives of all parties talking about how fantastic it is to give power away from Whitehall and give it back to local people and local county. You'd have never heard the Tories say that 15, 20 years ago. And that's partly a function of the fact that they've been out of power for 10 years. And then Labour, the Labour Party's almost conflicted, I think, on the issue of devolution. There's a very strong vein in the Labour Party that actually says that a centralised, strong centre state is the best way to guarantee equality, because it can redistribute, tax, raise revenues, redistribute accordingly. And there's those people within the Labour Party, they're really quite worried about devolution. They think that would allow the more difficult areas to fall further behind. So, it's not straightforward.
I mean, I'm picking up amongst the Liberals and amongst the Tories this kind of theme of liberty.
Yeah.
And they're both trying to own that territory. And I think that Cameron might be onto something when he talks about, wanting to give powers away to people over schools, like to police chiefs, more, democracy at a local level. Do you think that the dominant theme in politics over the next few years will be, to appear to be at least, trying to be localist?
Well, I think that there's certainly a lot of rhetoric around that, and one thing I have warned people against, I think it's just as current now actually, is this gap between rhetoric and reality. Ministers in the last year have been saying things like, centralist Whitehall is the biggest obstacle to progress, but then, they're not going to give power away from Whitehall, so you just have to be careful about stuff like that. But I think they are going to talk the talk of localism. I think one of the big questions is, what's the role of local government? What's the role of elected local councillors and elected city leaders in all this, when what you've got now is there's a big push for what's called participatory democracy and budgeting, all this stuff about let's get 100 people in a town hall and decide how to spend 20 million, the Hazel approach, right? Which isn't an approach for spending all the money, but it's an angle on how to spend some of it. But this direct engagement, citizens' juries, so we've heard about them in recent weeks as well. But also you've got the third sector, social enterprises, Cameron talking a lot about how they should have a much bigger role in delivering services. The business community, I'm picking up an awful lot from the British Chambers of Commerce about how they want a leadership role in cities. And so actually what you've got is, you used to have local councils front and centre, guaranteed the lion's share of the role in running cities. Now it looks like they've got to share it with all these different diverse groups, which is in many ways a good thing. But I think it requires local government and councillors to almost restate and reclaim their position, because it's not guaranteed anymore. And if they're not careful with the decline of party politics, you could find them becoming increasingly irrelevant, and other deliverers like social enterprises, business leaders, and people themselves actually having a bigger say in running the affairs of cities.
I don't want to embarrass you, but you've done a huge amount of work on cities, potential solutions, more than anybody else in this area. You've also worked with those people who are now the centre of government, Gordon Brown. What is the thinking? Is it just rebranding, or is it genuinely they're going to try something else?
No, I think that there was always a very big drive on Gordon's part around constitutional reform. And that is now being unveiled. There was that enormous document published before the summer recess on governing Britain. We're going to see a constitutional reform bill. And, so that's not just branding. I think there's a real desire to reframe the relationship between central government, local government and individual voters. I think that's substantial. But I think there's still a lot of detail to play for. It is not clear precisely how far this government wants to go on devolving power, getting back to your point about, if you're in power, you're slightly less keen to give it away. And I think the next year or so is going to be critical in working out, are big cities going to get budgets, revenue-raising powers? And I believe that the financial aspect of devolution is key, because only when government centrally devolves money-raising powers and devolves budgets is it serious about devolving.
Do you think that Gordon Brown might sort of try and pick winners and say, OK, well, Manchester's well run, Manchester's hosted a lot of big events, Manchester's going for congestion charging, let's try Manchester as a model, let them go away.
I think that is definitely on the cards. I think that some big cities have done better than others at presenting a united front, a clear business case for taking on more powers. And I think Manchester's been probably the best at doing that. And I don't just think it's because Manchester's a Labour council. It's actually been a greater Manchester story with 10 local authorities, including a couple of non-Labour ones. So I think they are at the front of the queue, and they are likely to get progress on congestion charging, progress on devolved budgets over transport and skills, and I think that's the way it'll work. And I think they'll get more powers, and then others will be a bit jealous that they don't have the powers, and then they'll suddenly sort of put their house in order and stake their claim as well.
In terms of the future, I mean, Manchester's a good example on policy. Whenever we talk about city regeneration, we tend to think of gleaming buildings in city centres. Manchester's got a fantastic centre, but still huge deprivation, huge unemployment in the city generally. Do we need to sort of change focus totally to try and bring up cities as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been... We did a report just a couple of months ago called Two Track Cities about, the massive difference in performance between Burnley on the one hand and Reading on the other, opposite ends of the table. But in that report, and I think what's clear is that over the last 10 years, pretty much every city centre has been transformed. And that's great, and you can get a latte or live in a loft or go to Zara pretty much in any city centre. Fantastic. But if you walk 5 or 10 minutes from Piccadilly Station in Manchester, Lime Street in Liverpool, you're in neighbourhoods that look like they've actually got worse, not better. And relatively speaking, they probably have got worse because the good places look now so much better. So I think we need to move the regeneration debate now from the centres of cities into what we call the sort of donuts around them, where there isn't really an obvious case for business to locate there. They look pretty run down. They've got bad worklessness and health and crime problems. And I think that's the next challenge for urban regeneration in the decade ahead, and it's much harder to sort those places out than city centres.
Do you think that part of the regeneration agenda to an extent has been hijacked by property developments, and so it's all building-led and not people-led?
Well, I think that the property story in cities has been interesting and a necessary one. I think some of the work we've seen by Urban Splash and others in Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham have taken either disused, derelict or poorly used buildings and transformed them. That again is great news, but relatively speaking, that's the easy stuff. Transforming a physical building into something that is livable in or workable in is I think, as I say, relatively straightforward. Difficult, but relatively straightforward. What's much harder is 28% of adults in Liverpool don't have a qualification. Right now, that's decades of underperformance by schools, FE colleges, but that is much harder to turn around than knocking up a new office building. And I think that it's on those issues that I think we now need to start focusing much more.
It's interesting, in a lot of cities that are doing really well, London, Manchester, Birmingham, whenever an organisation or a company comes and relocates into the area, part of the justification for the building or the infrastructure is the amount of jobs it will create. I get a sense that in some cities the jobs that are being created now are not being filled by local people because there isn't the qualifications, and labour's coming in from outside, so Eastern Europe. Yeah. Do you think that there should be some sort of, if you like, some sort of way of cajoling business and saying, OK, we'll give you planning permission here, but you've also got to commit to train 20% of people in computers or relevant skills?
I mean, that is an idea. I mean, I would worry about that on one front, which is that placing the burden solely on employers to make good a shortfall in the skills makeup of the workforce. I mean, I think they should play a role, absolutely, but I think we need to look to the efficiency of our government-sponsored training agencies as well. And also, I wouldn't want in any way to sort of turn the tap off of skilled migrant workers, because quite frankly they're keeping places like London and Manchester going. We couldn't do without those workers, and they're absolutely vital. The fact that there are other workers or potential workers who are not sufficiently skilled is a parallel and linked but separate problem. We need to sort that out. But I think the migrant story has been essential to the growth success of lots of our cities.